Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis, and this is the final review of our introductory unit that covered American history before 1877. You probably first learned about this part of our country's history in elementary and middle school, but before we start learning new things, it's a good idea to remind ourselves of how our country got started. To get started, let's first put things in context by looking at some dates. As you may remember from your world history class, Columbus arrived in America in 1492. And this started the age of colonization. Of course, at first it was mostly the Spanish, Portuguese, and French who were settling in the Americas. It wasn't until 1607, over 100 years later, that the first English settlers arrived and created Jamestown in what is now Virginia. And over the next 160 years, more and more English settlers came and created the first 13 colonies. Then in 1776, those colonists declared independence from England and created the United States. A few years later, in 1789, they wrote the Constitution, the rulebook for our country's government. Throughout the 1800s, the nation grew as white settlers moved west, and by 1900, the map of the United States looked like what we see today. In the 1860s, the nation went through its greatest test when 11 southern states tried to separate and make a new country. They failed, of course, and the period of time after the war, called Reconstruction, ended in 1877, which is where we're going to start our class. We broke down this introductory unit into 4 lessons. Let's get started. Our first lesson was about the English colonies. As you review this lesson, notice how the colonies were different from one another, even though they were all created by people who came from England. We can still find evidence of these differences today, and in the 1860s, they led to mistrust and civil war.
Big idea. The United States is made up of many different people, but the origins of the nation lie in English settlements along the Atlantic coast in the 1600s. People came there for different reasons, and some were brought from Africa as slaves. The English developed their first colony in America at Jamestown. It was a business venture that failed in the beginning. The settlers did not know how to farm, so they starved. Only with the help from local Native Americans did some settlers survive. However, they discovered that they could grow tobacco, which they could sell back in Europe. Tobacco made Jamestown and the surrounding Chesapeake Bay region profitable. Work in the colonies was done both by indentured servants and eventually by African slaves. Merchants made a lot of money buying and selling slaves. They were an important part of the triangle trade. Slaves were purchased in Africa and brought to the Americas. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other raw materials were loaded onto the ships in America and taken back to Europe. In Europe, the ships were reloaded with finished products like furniture and guns, which were shipped off to Africa. In time, slaves were seen as property, the same as horses or wagons. Strict codes or laws were passed throughout the colonies, defining the various rights slaves did not have and restricting aspects of their lives. Some slaves resisted, but these rebellions were always stopped and resulted in the passage of more strict slave codes. New England was settled by religious dissenters who wanted to create a new life for their families far from the control of the English church leaders. They created a society based on religion and towns rather than wealth and cash crop exports. Plymouth was founded by separatists called Pilgrims. They were a small group, but set an important precedent in America by agreeing to the Mayflower Compact and holding elections for community leaders. A much larger group came to nearby Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were Puritans rather than separatists. They believed in a covenant with God. They thought if they were good Christians, God would reward them and make their colony prosper. They also believed their colony would be an example of a purer society on earth that everyone else could copy. They referred to it as a city upon a hill. Between New England and the Chesapeake colonies that grew up around Jamestown, there were a variety of other English colonies. These were often more focused on trade and more tolerant of differences. In the interior, non-English groups settled, who also left their mark on the nation.
The second lesson told the story of the Revolution, the time when those English colonists decided that they were done being English in America and were ready to be Americans instead. Pay attention to the connection between the problems the colonists had with the English government and how they tried to create a new country and a new government that would protect them and above all us from having those same problems come back again.
Big idea. Americans declared and fought for independence for a variety of reasons. Enlightenment ideas about government and economic factors were both important. These ideas were later incorporated into a new system of government. The English settlers in America chose to declare and fight for independence after a long series of conflicts with their government. Most of these centered around economic problems and their right to participate in government. Americans were influenced by Enlightenment ideas. American leaders did not want to declare independence right away and tried unsuccessfully to resolve their differences with the government in England. The Declaration of Independence laid out the reasons for independence and remains an important document in American history. The War for Independence was long and difficult. Eventually, with the help of the French, Washington's army was able to force the British to surrender and recognize American independence. For the first few years of American independence, the federal government was weak and ineffective at dealing with major problems. Rebellion in Massachusetts eventually pushed leaders to seek a new system of government. The creation of the Constitution and our current system of government was due to problems that existed in the late 1780s and was the result of a series of compromises. The Founding Fathers tried to enshrine the ideas of the Revolution in a functioning system of government. The debate about the ratification of the new Constitution divided the nation's leaders, but led to the creation of the Bill of Rights.
Now that we have a new baby United States, it's time to tell the story of how it grew. There's some sad parts of this story, and Hispanic and Native Americans pushed aside by whites moving west. But remember that the idea of manifest destiny was very popular in the 1800s, and it may be unfair to judge people from the past against our current beliefs about what is right and wrong.
Big idea. Since the first English settlements along the Atlantic coast, white Americans spread westward and were involved in conflicts with both Native Americans and Mexicans who blocked the spread of the United States across the continent. Native Americans had been fighting white expansion for many years. Their primary goal was preserving their land, which was the principal factor in their decisions about who to side with in the 7 Years' War, American Revolution, War of 1812, and their own conflicts with white Americans. Americans who moved to Texas initiated a war for independence from Mexico, and later President Polk launched a war against Mexico that resulted in Mexico giving up half its land to the United States. Hispanics who found themselves in the United States after the Mexican-American War often lost their land to whites. Some fought back, but they generally lost out as whites moved west. There were many groups of people who defined the character of the West. Mountain men, miners, were some of the first whites to move into the West. Later, ranchers and eventually pioneer farmers moved west. As whites settled in new territories, railroads were built to connect them. The last violent conflicts between whites and independent Native Americans were in the late 1800s on the Great Plains. Ultimately, the Army defeated the last of the tribes and forced them to move to reservations where official government policy attempted to destroy Native culture.
Our final lesson was about the Civil War. We know that African slaves were brought to America just a few years after the arrival of the first colonists. Their work helped make the country rich. But slavery was like a stain that the nation's leaders could never find a way to get out. As you review this lesson, notice that although the root cause of the war was slavery, the timing of when the war happened connects to the country's growth.
Big idea. In the 1800s, slavery divided America. In 1860, things fell apart, and the northern states and southern states fought a long, bloody civil war. The North won, preserving the country and ending slavery. However, Southern white leaders were able to maintain the social hierarchy that kept African Americans at the bottom of the social structure. Slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. As the nation grew, slavery also grew and formed the basis for much of the nation's wealth. The small abolition movement in the North slowly gained support and helped facilitate a system to help slaves escape to freedom in Canada. Westward expansion increased conflicts about slavery as the addition of each new state threatened to upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. Politicians tried compromise and popular sovereignty to deal with this problem. In the 1850s, politicians tried but were unable to stop the increasingly divisive issue of slavery from leading to the outbreak of war between the slave states in the South and the free states in the North. The North and South both had advantages and weaknesses in the Civil War, but eventually the North's industrial might and willingness to persevere through a long and destructive war led to victory. Northerners, led by President Lincoln, originally were fighting to preserve the Union. By the end of the war, Lincoln had made ending slavery a part of the North's mission, giving the war a moral purpose. After the war ended in 1865, Northerners tried unsuccessfully to remake Southern society. Although it is often said that the South won Reconstruction, 3 constitutional amendments were passed that ended slavery, gave citizenship to anyone born in the United States, and guaranteed the right to vote to all men.
I really love American history, and I want you to be able to understand and appreciate the richness of our country's stories as well. As we learn these stories this year, a solid understanding of where the United States came from will be useful. So congratulations on spending a little time on this introduction. There's quite a bit of information here. Make sure you use the Quizlet set to help you remember all the people, events, and key ideas. And of course, use the summaries so you can remember how all those people, events, and ideas fit together. Study hard. The people who made our country sure went through some hard times, and I want your test day to be a moment of triumph instead.